This meeting is being recorded.
All right, welcome everyone. Thanks so much for joining us for our first lecture of 2022. My name is Katie Worthing and I'm the Executive Director of the Yarmouth History Center. Just a couple points before I introduce our speaker. First off, we'd like to thank the Leon and Lisa Gorman Fund for supporting our lecture series. Thank you also to all of the members who are here. We appreciate your support. This is what helps us put on programs like this, so thank you for that. A couple of housekeeping items. If you could please keep yourselves on mute during the talk, that'll maximize the audio quality for everyone. We will have time at the end of the talk for questions. If you think of one during the talk, you're welcome to pop it into the chat box and I'll pose questions to Anne at the end of the talk. It's a small group, so we can also probably just turn mics off and have a little discussion at the end of the talk too. And Anne put some information in the chat box too about her website and where to get her book too. So there's that info there as well. And now for tonight's speaker, we're pleased to welcome Anne B. Gass to our lecture series. She is the author of We Demand, the Suffrage Road Trip, as well as the 2014 book, Voting Down the Rows. She's lectured extensively about women's suffrage throughout Maine and the region, and currently serves on the steering committee of the Maine Suffrage Centennial Collaborative, as well as she's the Maine coordinator for the National Votes for Women Trail. She also serves on the Maine's Permanent Commission on the Status of Women and is vice president of the Gray Town Council. Welcome, Anne. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Katie. Thanks so much for organizing this. I really appreciate it. And thanks to you all for coming tonight. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen right away, and we can just take off and feel free to, as Katie said, put your questions in the chat, or I think we will be able to, because it's a small group, just to have a conversation at the end. Okay, so We Demand, the Suffrage Road Trip is a historical novel. It's based on the true story of an epic journey that took place in 1915. And just a quick shout out to my daughter, Emma Levitt, who did the cover and the chapter illustrations for me. So this trip wasn't the first ever cross-country road trip undertaken by women, but it's the first one ever undertaken for a cause, I think. And the cause was, of course, voting rights for women or women's suffrage. And it's an example of the really extraordinary lengths to which women had to go in order to win the right to vote. Much different from just about any other group in the country. So very briefly, as the backstory, it was launched by an organization called the Congressional Union for Women's Suffrage. In late September, 4 women left San Francisco's Panama-Pacific International Exposition for Washington, D.C. And their mission is to deliver to Congress and the president a monster petition. You can see here in the slide, that's, clips from a newspaper article. It was always referred to as the monster petition, with 500,000 signatures on it, demanding an amendment to the U.S. Constitution enfranchising women. They have to arrive on December 6th. The opening day of Congress. There are big events planned. And it's, the We Demand, this is actually an image of one of the banners that they used to use. And it was very different for women to demand suffrage and not just ask nicely for it. So that's kind of a theme of this trip. And then one of the reasons why the signatures are such a big deal is that there are no polls in 1915. So they're an important way for women to signal their passion for a cause. And 20,000, oops, excuse me a sec. Hang on. Oh my God, I had a phone call come in. It's really a different scenario for them to be demanding. And a lot of women and men thought it was quite rude for them to demand rather than to ask politely. And in 1915, it was 67 years from the Seneca Falls Convention that had taken place in 1848, and 126 years from the Constitution's adoption. In 1848, that Seneca Falls Convention is often sort of seen as the first or the start of the organized effort for women's rights in the US. So, 67 years is a really long time. 126 years from the Constitution's adoption is also a long time. And the thing is, they didn't really know how much longer it would take to win voting rights. Was it going to be just 1 more year, 5 more years, 10, 20, another 50? They didn't know. And women had come from all kinds of different causes to join the suffrage fight, labor, social work, peace. They wanted to get back to their causes, and they were getting kind of tired of suffrage. So that was part of the impetus behind shifting this focus towards demanding an amendment to the US Constitution enfranchising women. So it's worth sort of noting that in 1915, the US Constitution explicitly recognized only men's voting rights, as I said. And, this has been going on for a long time. And the Congressional Union shifts the discussion or the focus of the work away from getting suffrage state by state, which is what they've been doing for decades, and instead going after this federal amendment. And not just that, but they're going to use kind of more controversial tactics. And one of them is to punish the political party in power for failing to move the federal suffrage amendment through Congress. Because, Susan B. Anthony had arranged for the federal amendment to be introduced back when she was still alive. So it's been introduced in Congress for decades. It just never goes anywhere. It gets bottled up in committee. And Alice Paul is this young suffragist who's, leads the Congressional Union in support of this federal amendment strategy. And she's sort of done with this state by state stuff. By 1915, there had been well over 500 state campaigns, and yet only 13 or 14 states had enfranchised women in that way, or using that strategy. Here's an example of the suffrage map from that era. You can see all these states that are white are the ones that are equal suffrage states. The black states are, there's no equal suffrage there. Maine is in that group, you can see. And then the shaded states have offered women some sort of suffrage, either through like municipal, they could vote in municipal elections or school board elections, or sometimes just presidential elections. I mean, it really kind of ran the gamut. So it's taken a long time to get to this point, but the good news is there are something like 4 million women, the Congressional Union estimates, that now have the right to vote. And if they could be harnessed, all those votes could be harnessed and sort of used in the same way, they could determine the outcome of the presidential election in 1916. So this trip is kind of a warning to the Democrats, really. This is a graphic from that time period. You can see this is the modern woman voter is striding across the country from those equal suffrage states in the West towards to come to the aid of her benighted Eastern sisters who are in the black pit of despair because they don't have equal rights. You can see a few things that are interesting about this modern woman voter. And she's young, she's beautiful, she looks like a goddess, really. She looks intelligent, and she's white, and that's none of that is an accident. That's very much a concerted effort on the part of the suffrage leaders to portray the modern woman voter in the most desirable way they could think of. She's not black, and because they know that they need the southern states to get it through Congress and then to ratify the amendment once it gets out of Congress. And so they definitely are kind of tiptoeing around the fact that this would enfranchise Black women as well. So it starts from this Panama-Pacific International Exposition in San Francisco in 1915, and the Congressional Union is the only suffrage organization to have a booth at the Panama-Pacific. So here's their booth, and this is where they collect all those signatures. Those 500,000 signatures, and they have literature here for people to look through. Something like 14 million people came through the Panama-Pacific that year, and a bunch of them ended up in the Congressional Union's booth here and signed the petition. And then So part of their planning is that they're going to do this cross-country road trip to drive the petitions to DC. And it's going to be launched from what they bill as the first ever in the history of the world convention of women voters. Going to be held at the exposition in mid-September. And this graphic comes from the front cover of the Suffragist, which was the Congressional Union's weekly newspaper. And it was kind of interesting to read through the issues of the Suffragist leading up to this big voters convention. You know, in the winter, they start saying, oh, we're going to send 100 cars across the country. It'll be amazing. And you know, it's a great idea and everybody loves it. But there's just one problem, and that is nobody volunteers to go. And so it's August, and they're still looking around wondering who's going to make this trip. And excuse me. So they're starting to get kind of nervous because the Congressional Union doesn't have any money, and they're a new organization. They don't have deep pockets. But then into the booth one day wandered these two women, who are Ingeborg Ginstedt and Maria Ginberg, who are Swedish immigrants. And they're middle-aged, likely lesbians. And they say, oh, well, we live in Providence, Rhode Island, and we'd love to take these petitions back with us because we took a boat out here to San Francisco. And we were planning to buy a car here and drive back across the country. And Providence is not that far from DC, so we can just stop by there and drop off the petitions. It's really not clear that they understood what they were getting themselves into and volunteering for this journey. And in the end, they're the only ones who volunteered. And it's lucky, I think, that they were the only ones, because there's just no way in hell they would have gotten 100 cars driven by women across the country in a caravan like that. I just don't think there weren't the facilities, there wasn't the fuel. I'm not sure how they would have done it logistically. And so here they are. I'm going to introduce them a little bit more. So Ingeborg Ginstedt was called the mechanician, or the mechanic, for the journey. He was 50 years old at the time of this trip. She was a radical. She was a member of the Industrial Workers of the World, and an aspiring suffrage leader. She was kind of new to the suffrage cause. This is how I describe her as a young woman, and she's not that different in 1915. She rode her life like a half-broken colt, plunging from one thing to another, curious and nippy, fighting efforts to rein her in. She was always restless, alert for something new. And then in 1915, during the journey, she's a wild and grim thing with close-set, deep blue eyes startling out from her weather-beaten face, nose like a prize fighter, stubborn chin. Famously, she was said to be a very kind of cranky and irritable person. And so I ended up kind of using that, and I'll talk a little bit more about that as we go forward. But she was one of the other envoys who made the trip, just really didn't like her at all, and always painted her in a very negative light. So her companion is Maria Ginberg. She was 55 years old at the time of this trip. She bought and drove the car. She was a midwife by trade. She'd delivered something like 2,000 babies by the time she, showed up at the Panama-Pacific, and that's where she earned her money to buy the car. This is what I say about Maria. She was as frugal with words as she was with her money. She said both were things you couldn't take back if you used them unwisely. She liked routine and didn't look for trouble, but could hold her own if it found her. Once Ingeborg had seen her verbally dismantle a cocky Coleman who'd tried to shortchange her on a delivery. Mostly, though, she was easygoing and steady. She didn't like the limelight as much as Ingeborg did, and was happy just to be the driver. And she was, maybe because she was a midwife, she was said to be a lot more, maternal and caring and easy to get along with. So here's their passenger who makes it all the way across the country is Sarah Bard Field. And she was 34 years old at the time of this trip. She didn't know how to drive, but she was a poet and a bohemian and a kind of a veteran of other suffrage battles in other states. And that was why Alice Paul wanted her to go on this trip. She also needed money because she had divorced her first husband and needed to earn her own way and help support their two kids who lived with him. She had a lover who was 30 years her senior. He lived in Portland, Oregon with his wife and family, and she lived in San Francisco. So she was kind of she had heart issues. She had, her affairs of the heart were causing her a lot of distress, but she also seemed to be in frail health. She'd had malaria leading up to this trip in the summer. And she also just had a dicky heart. I'm not exactly sure what was wrong with it, but at higher elevation, she had some difficulty, and it made her very weak and dizzy to be at higher elevations. And just the strain of the travel was hard for her. But the reason why we know so much about this trip is that she wrote these voluminous letters to her lover almost every night, and described a lot of the trip in detail. And again, I mean, she didn't like Ingeborg and painted her in a pretty negative light. Frances Joliffe was the other envoy who leaves San Francisco with them. She was a Democrat who had campaigned hard for Wilson in 1912. And so Alice Paul wanted her on the trip because she thought that, she could have some influence over the Democrats in Washington, who had majorities in both houses of Congress. And of course, Woodrow Wilson was a Democrat. So they're looking for the Democrats to lead the way on this suffrage federal amendment. But Frances actually makes it only as far as Sacramento, and then she bails out. She doesn't rejoin them until Albany, New York. So it's just really the three of them across most of the country. And then Mabel Verdon was the advance organizer on this trip. And she was a couple years older than Alice Paul, had gone to Swarthmore with her. And she was from Delaware, just an incredibly tireless organizer, very skilled. And her job was to leapfrog across the country in front of the envoys and set up these rallies in the towns and cities that they went through. She would go ahead by train. And then the last character really is the car. I mean, this is a car that was built by the Willis Overland Company in Toledo, Ohio. And, there were dozens of automobile manufacturers in those days. And I think to grab some market share, they had decided to drop the price substantially and market it heavily at the Panama-Pacific. They'd even advertised in Swedish language newspapers, which is perhaps where the Swedes found out about it, and maybe that's what persuaded them to buy it. But you can see, there's room in the running boards for their luggage, and on the other side of the car there would have been cans of fuel and water and oil. But there's one thing this car doesn't really have, and that's a top, which is a big deal because they're leaving San Francisco at the end of September, and they're going to be on the East Coast in November, December. It does have kind of a convertible top they can roll up, but it kind of traps the fumes when they're running with it down. And so they try to run with it up as much as they possibly can. And of course, the car doesn't have heat or air conditioning. And it's kind of leaky, when they go through a dusty area, dust all comes in the car. So it's a pretty tough ride, really. I mean, it's a decent car, but the roads were bad, and it was a tough ride for sure. And I have them christen the car Emilia Ratu, after a Swedish suffragist. So this is their route. It's the Lincoln Highway, which is kind of a glorious term for what was really a cart track for much of the country. And they would have these little red, white, and blue markers to depict the route. But I mean, you had to, roads would get washed out and they'd have to go 70 miles around, they'd have to plow through streams in order to get through them. I mean, there weren't a lot of bridges. It was problematic for sure. And the bright red line is where they deviate from the Lincoln Highway. So you can kind of get a sense of where they're going. So they leave San Francisco and, head out. They lose Francis Joliffe in Sacramento and make it over the Sierra Nevada and across Nevada, which is no easy feat. And then they end up in Salt Lake City. And this is a picture that gives you a sense of what these rallies look like. The women are all wearing these purple, white, and gold sashes that's the colors of the Congressional Union. And they would bring in affluent, or more prominent women, preferably those who had been really involved in suffrage battles in their own states. But they'd also invite men, and in this particular event, which was held on the steps of the Capitol in Salt Lake City, they had the governor of Utah and the mayor of Salt Lake City and a number of congressmen. So, you can see that this is kind of what Mabel Vernon's organizing. This is how it pays off, is to get these prominent people together, united behind the strategy of the federal amendment in city after city across the country, because there's no 24-hour news cycle. It's pretty hard to get the word out. And so that's another reason for the importance of this trip. And here's another photo. I love this one. They're in Colorado Springs and they just look beat. I mean, they've been driving for weeks. They don't get a lot of time off. They've had no time off since Salt Lake City. Basically, they've just been on the road, and it's been a really tough go. This other woman in the car with them is Bertha Fowler, who is the Colorado the head of the Colorado branch of the Congressional Union. But I mean, the three travelers just look like they're about to kill each other. And it just makes me laugh, because I don't know if you've ever traveled with somebody for a long period of time, but even when you love them, they get on your nerves and you kind of want to kill them. As I mentioned, the roads weren't good in places, and this is in Kansas. This is not their car. Of course, it has a top, but it's very much from that era. And when I came across the country in 2015, I retraced their route. And I found this photo in a historical, in a museum out there. And so, they get stuck in the mud in Kansas at night. And this is how I write about it in the book. The mud was the real worry, though. In some sections, it came halfway up Amelia's tires, and she had to plunge through one hole after another. Maria clung to the steering wheel, grim-faced, as Amelia churned along, slipping and sliding. They rode silently, listening to the sound of the engine laboring, all of them fluent now in the language of pistons and sparks, and alert to any sign of distress. No one else was traveling this late at night, and aside from the occasional farmhouse, they were utterly alone. Without warning, Amelia's nose dropped, and there was a sickening slide into deep muck. Her engine wailed as Maria tried first to jam forward through the mud hole, then to reverse backward over the lip they'd just come down. No luck. After a death rattle, Amelia quit for good. Water began seeping through the floorboards as Maria ground on the starter, but the engine wouldn't catch. So they're well and truly stuck there in the mud at night in Kansas. It looked very much like this in the sense there were no houses around them. And, how do they extricate themselves from this mess? Do they make it to DC on the appointed day and time? You're going to have to read the book to find out. So I'm going to pivot now to talk about my strategy in writing this book. And I first learned about it in the course of researching and writing my first book, which was about my great-grandmother voting down the rows. And I noticed that histories of the American suffrage movement often mention the trip, but only briefly. Sometimes Ingeborg and Maria aren't even mentioned. And when they are, we see them only through Sarah's eyes, which as I said, was mostly unflattering. It's been interesting to me that Sarah has, she always gets the love in all these other historical accounts, but people who've read We Demand tell me that they don't much care for Sarah, but they really like Ingeborg and Maria. So clearly it matters who tells the story, who gets to paint the picture. There's a Nigerian author I like whose name is Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie, and she warns of the danger of the single story. She says the single story creates stereotypes, and the problem with stereotypes is not that they are untrue, but that they're incomplete. They make one story become the only story. And I'm just going to kind of page through some of these other photos as I talk through this, and tell about the last 5 years or so, the single story that had been told about the American suffrage movement was from the perspective of white middle-class women like Sarah. And it was incomplete. But thanks to pushback and research from people of color and their allies, we're starting to have a much richer and more complex understanding of the US suffrage movement. So as I mentioned, in 2015, I spent about 8 weeks retracing their original route. And as I came across the country, I was talking to women's rights activists and leagues of women voters, groups like that, trying to understand what difference having had them vote meant for women in the preceding century. And I was also doing research at libraries and historical societies and archives to try and learn more about the original trip. And it became really clear to me that it was an important question of whose history was this? It wasn't Black history. They weren't allowed on the stage. It wasn't Indigenous peoples because they weren't even considered US citizens until 1924. So the 19th Amendment didn't enfranchise them. And you don't see any Hispanics or Asian Americans on the stages either. No, and not really a lot of labor, working women or, people in the labor movement. So that's part of what pushed me to tell a different version of this suffrage story. And ultimately, I wrote a novel because it was the only way I could think of to get away from the single story and tell it from the perspective of Ingeborg and Maria, who had been kind of othered and silenced. They weren't allowed to speak themselves on the way across the country. They were always kind of treated as the help. But writing it as a novel allowed me to pay tribute to the grit and determination of the women who made the trip, as well as of the Congressional Union. And I ended up sort of weaving together the fact and fiction using the history of the actual trip as my training wheels. Because despite my best efforts, I even went to Sweden. I just wasn't able to learn much about Ingeborg and Maria and what they thought about the trip. They just didn't leave much of a written record behind that I was able to find. So I ended up creating their characters around the little that I was able to find out. So we know from the census that Ingeborg and Maria lived together from at least 1895. So I made them romantic partners, even though there's no actual documentation of that. I mean, of course, in 1915, they wouldn't have been shouting that from the rooftops. But so-called Boston marriages were pretty common in the early 20th century, usually where two affluent unmarried women lived together. So it could have just been that, but there was definitely a queer element in the suffrage movement, and I wanted to highlight that, but it was a secret that they shared with very few people. And as I mentioned, Sarah and Mabel both described Ingeborg as kind of irritable, and I chose to reframe her irritability as justified, because even during the trip, as I said, and she and Maria were kind of ignored. Newspaper coverage sometimes would highlight both Sarah and Frances Joliffe being in the trip, even when Frances Joliffe hadn't been around for weeks. And they wouldn't even mention Ingeborg and Maria. And when they did, they just referred them as the driver and the mechanic. Well, I mean, Ingeborg changed a dozen tires or kind of fixed a dozen tires coming across the country. She could also fix a lot of what went on or went wrong under the hood, brakes and things like that. The only thing that she couldn't really fix herself, I think, was a broken axle that happened in Western New York. So she was pretty amazing, and I just thought that she deserved a little bit more credit. And she might have felt that way herself. And perhaps it would have made her cranky enough to, I don't know, send press releases to newspapers, to Swedish language newspapers, describing the trip, but leaving out any references to Sarah Bard Field or to Frances Joliffe, which is in fact what happened. I mean, I don't know whether or not Ingeborg was behind this, but I was able to track down some Swedish language newspapers from cities that they drove through, and they look a lot like this. I mean, this is just an excerpt, but Sarah and Frances aren't even mentioned. It just mentions Ingeborg and Maria, which I thought was pretty hilarious, actually. And so, perhaps that's the way she got her revenge. So they also didn't do side trips or have side meetings with other historical figures, but I thought it was an important way to showcase kind of what was happening at the time. And so I have her I have Ingeborg meet with Joe Hill, who was also a member of the Radical Industrial Workers of the World and a songwriter. And he was, in fact, imprisoned in the Sugar House prison, which is just outside Salt Lake City when they drove through. He was really just weeks away from being murdered by the state or executed for a crime that most people thought he hadn't done, a murder of a grocer. Because he was also a Swedish immigrant and there was a ton of press about his case and it had been going on for a year or two already, I'm certain that Ingeborg would have known about him and she would have wanted to see him. So I have her do a little side trip to talk to Joe. And also in Chicago, I have them talk to Ida B. Wells, who is this amazing journalist and suffrage activist and anti-lynching activist. She was born a slave in the South, but ends up moving to Chicago because her life is threatened because of her activism, especially her anti-lynching activism. And she kind of gives them a piece of her mind because she says, you know, there's a place in my car and in your car for somebody who looks like me. But she's, you know, they're really wrestling with the racism of the suffrage movement and what that means potentially for Black Americans. And then finally, I have them also in Chicago meet with Clarence Darrow because it just amused me that Sarah's older sister, Mary, was actually Clarence Darrow's lover for many years. And so Sarah knew him, and it's very likely that they would have wanted to see him in Chicago. And he was very famous for defending labor activists and sometimes African Americans who got into trouble with the law. So I just, as I sort of get to the close here, I just wanted to return to the petitions because they're such an important part of the story. And, you know, I as my way across the country, I was talking to people in 2015. Trump wasn't yet the Republicans' choice for president, but you know, he was making a lot of noise, and still there was a lot of hope that Hillary Clinton would be the first woman president. Of course, that didn't happen. But there was a lot of noise coming from Trump himself and from his supporters that was, you know, misogynistic, racist, you know, xenophobic, just anti-labor, you know, just a lot of nasty stuff that seemed to really parallel the research that I was doing into the early 20th century. It just sounded no different. So I kind of wove a lot of that into the story as well. But the petitions, I just wanted to mention, for me, they're kind of a potent symbol of how long and hard women had to work to win voting rights and of how uncertain the future of the movement was for these suffragists in 1915. And the petitions remind us that as frustrating as it must have been for them when they, you know, experienced defeat time after time, in the US at least, the suffragist protests were always peaceful, not like January 6th of 21 in this country. And as Ingeborg reflects on the petitions, it occurred to her that the pages of all the many petitions gathered over decades from white women and colored, from Eastern and Western states, by Susan B. Anthony and countless others, would stretch for hundreds of miles. And every page would have carried the hopes and dreams of both the signers and the collectors. What a wretched waste of time it all had been, she thought, suddenly angry. Surely the generations of women who had worked so hard to reach this moment could have set their hands to some better purpose. How many more petitions would be required to end this one battle? And so the petitions in this cover design weave through different groups of women through time, and then end up, and all of these images actually were from original photos from the period that Emma just modified. And then eventually the petitions become the road under the wheels of Amelia. And I just really love the image that she put together for that. So here they are, the Fabulous Four, I think in DC. They all look a little the worse for the wear, as you can see. So this book is about a journey on many levels. The 1915 trip itself, and the journey that the suffrage movement took to where it was in 1915. And then the journeys that the individual participants took and how it changed them, because it did change them. And though I'm not in the book myself, it kind of reflects my own journey, which I'm still on, in understanding this history and its connection to the present. So if you don't know the 19th Amendment, this simple statement took 72 years to get into our Constitution if you date it just from the Seneca Falls Convention in 1848. Obviously much longer if you go back to when the Constitution was first adopted. It's kind of amazing to me that it took that long and at such cost, at such a struggle. I love this quote from Alice Paul. I never doubted that equal rights was the right direction. Most reforms, most problems are complicated, but to me, there's nothing complicated about ordinary equality. And equality, of course, is something that still eludes women because the Equal Rights Amendment has never been ratified, not at the federal level and not in Maine either. So women are still not equal to men in the foundational documents of our state or our country. It's important to know that. So what can you do? This is your own little piece of activism. We have a very robust League of Women Voters in this state. I really encourage you to join them and support them. But share this history, look into it. Maybe your own ancestors were involved in the suffrage movement. Urge your state and congressional reps to support the ERA and just spread the word about this history. I'm always up for a talk. I'm happy to come virtually, or if I can make it there in person, I'll do that too. I'm flying out to San Francisco in a couple of weeks to do a couple talks out there. And here's just my contact information. And again, I put my website in the chat, and you can also find a link to the We Demand book there. So I'm going to stop sharing this screen, and we can go to Q&A.
All right. Well, thanks so much. That was fascinating. And I'll just put in a little plug for our gift shop, because we do have the book in stock at our gift shop too, at the History Center.
Thank you.
Any questions? Feel free to unmute or use the chat box if you like. Well, I've got one. I'm curious about your archival sources. Did you is the petition preserved somewhere? Sarah's letters, are they published, or did you go to an archive or library to find those?
Yeah, Sarah's letters are out at the Huntington Museum and Library out in Pasadena, California. So I flew out there to read those. The suffragist I found at the Alice Paul Institute in New Jersey, which is Alice Paul's basically, birthplace. And also they're part of the National Women's Party papers at the Library of Congress. And I was able to get a lot of information from the Library of Congress. They have the archives. The National Women's Party actually is, the Congressional Union turns into the National Women's Party in 1917. So they have what they call the National Women's Party papers at the Library of Congress, but you can get them on microfilm from participating libraries. And that's what I did. I just had them shipped up to Portland and read them there on microfilm. So that was great to get that. And then newspapers.com, I had could get all the newspapers from the cities that they traveled through. And I did a lot of background reading about Swedish emigration and kind of what it was like for them when they arrived in the U.S. Labor, the industrial workers of the world, just all kinds of stuff. I mean, my original intent had been to write this as a nonfiction, so I went way overboard on the research. It was in the process of doing that I realized I can't write this about Marie and Ingeborg if I do it as a nonfiction, and that's when I went to a novel.
Great, thank you.
Hi, Ann. John Palmer speaking. Can you hear me, Ann?
Yeah, I can. Hi, John.
How are you?
Good.
Can you give us a couple of minutes on your great-grandmother and her involvement in the effort, particularly here in the state of Maine?
Yeah, so Florence Brooks Whitehouse was kind of late to the suffrage game. She didn't start till she was in her 40s, but by that time she was already an accomplished novelist. She'd written 2 novels and had been active in Portland's progressive movement. So she was very well connected and a very smart and capable organizer. And so she becomes the chair of the Maine branch of the Congressional Union in 1915. And she was actually in DC when the suffrage envoys arrived. She was there to greet them. She was down there for a conference. And and she later met Ingeborg. They participated in an action in DC together in 1918. But she didn't really have any involvement in this 1915 road trip. But she was very involved in leading Maine's effort to get its congressional delegation behind what becomes the 19th Amendment, to get it through Congress. And then once it's through Congress, it goes out to the states for ratification, and she really led Maine's effort to ratify.
How long did it take Maine to ratify?
Well, it got through Congress in June of 1919, and Maine ratified in November of 1919. We were the 19th state to ratify the 19th Amendment in November of 1919. That's how I always remember it. The final state to ratify was Tennessee in August of 1920. And interestingly, this sort of speaks to, maybe the rationale or behind the Congressional Union and the other suffrage organizers' strategy of focusing in on white voters. The last state to ratify was Tennessee. It passed by 1 vote, and in their house, and it was very tight. And at that point, the momentum around ratification was really slowing down. If it hadn't passed Tennessee, it's not clear what the next state would have been.
I'll ask one more quickie. Why hasn't Maine adopted? What are the forces that had caused Maine not to pass the ERA?
The Republicans and the Catholics, the Catholic Church.
The Catholic Church? Why the Catholic Church?
Abortion and birth control. The Catholic Church thinks that if women are equal to men, that it'll make abortion legal. It'll have to be legal everywhere. That's their rationale. They testified against it. The bill was up in the legislature this session. I testified for it, as did dozens of other people. The Catholic Church testified against it. Republicans also vote against it, I think for similar reasons. And in Maine, only 1 Republican voted for it in the House. It was in the Senate, actually. It was a Republican senator voted for it, but every other Republican voted against it.
All right, Patricia, I saw your hand.
Yeah, well, which Republican senator voted for it? Do you remember?
I can't remember. I'd have to go back and look, sorry.
That's okay, I can look too. I was going to ask, greetings from Norway, by the way. Thank you for hosting this. I very much enjoyed your talk. And did you happen to, I've been reading some mystery books by Inez Haynes Irwin, who also wrote a history of, strangely enough, of the women's suffragette movement. And when I was involved with the second wave, so to speak, in the late 60s, early 70s, really, Alice Paul was still alive. And so, you're mentioning Alice Paul. She was kind of the grande dame of the second wave and equal rights amendment. I think she lived until like 1987 or something like that.
Something like that, yeah.
So she was very old. But I wondered if you had come across, I have not sought out, but I mean to seek out the book by Inez Haynes Irwin. I wonder if you had read that history of, could recommend it or not.
The suffrage movement?
Yeah, of her.
Yeah.
Her history.
I haven't read it recently. I think I read it in connection with a research around my first book, so it's been quite a number of years. But I thought it was good. Obviously, right. It was a little whitewashed, and so you do have to kind of all the books, all the histories written at that time definitely were from a white perspective, and many since then. It was, as I said, only fairly recently that more scholarship has pushed to the fore more stories of sort of non-affluent white people
Yeah.
or non-white people.
All right, any other questions? Oh, I had one that it just caught my eye in the newspaper clipping you shared from the Swedish language newspaper. It mentioned something about how the women had fared well, except for a stretch through the desert where they had to have a male guide. Do you know more about that?
Yeah, actually, Maria had a car in Providence for her midwifery practice, but they sold that and we're going to buy this new car in San Francisco. But she was, she really had just driven in Providence or the surrounding towns. I mean, she hadn't piloted a car over a pass before, and they had to go over the Sierra Nevada, and the roads were, not the highways that they are today, and so they hired a man to get them over the Sierra Nevada into Reno, and he did fine. But then in Reno, they hired a different guy to get them to Salt Lake City because they had to cross Eastern Nevada, which is called the Great Basin. I don't know if anybody's ever driven across that, but it is desolate country. I'm here to tell you, I mean, I was in a new car with air conditioning and heat, and it was still grueling. I just hundreds and hundreds of miles and just nothing out there. And he got them lost, actually. I mean, they were supposed to get, they were going to stay at a ranch called the Ibapa Ranch. And they were supposed to get there about 10 o'clock at night. And at midnight, Sarah wakes up and realizes, there's no ranch. We're still driving around. Where are we? And it turns out that they're lost. And luckily they come to a crossroads where they find some couple of cowboys who are rolled up in their blankets asleep, and they wake them up and say, do you know the way to Ibapa Ranch? And they do. And they draw them a little map, and so they get to the ranch, but not till about 4 or 5 o'clock in the morning, and by that time they're just frozen, because the desert, of course, it's really cold at night and it's boiling hot during the day. But they had to get to Salt Lake City to that big event there. So they rest up for a few hours and then they keep going, and they make it to Salt Lake City late that night. So that was the last time they ever hired a man to drive them. They took care of it themselves after that.
Thank you. All right, last call for any final questions. Okay, well, thanks so much, Anne. That was really fascinating. Everyone go get that book, read it. Sounds like a fun trip virtually and in real life. Yeah, it's kind of a Thelma and Louise story, but with a happier ending. All right, well, thanks everyone for joining us. Have a great night. All right, thanks. Take care.